thank you so much. So today, I'm going to talk a bit about some recent research I've been doing. I'm a professor, as we mentioned, so I normally talk to academic audiences a little bit smaller than this one, but I'm super excited to be with you today. So according to various reports in the popular media in the US, but also beyond, every year for the last half decade or so were all year of the scam. Except 2017, for some reason, I can't find any evidence that anyone has ever called 2017 the year of the scam. But otherwise, 2016, 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, 22, and so on have all been described as year of the scam. Scams from catfishing to multi-level marketing schemes to sham cryptocurrencies abound on the social web. And some of the flashiest investment opportunities adjacent to the tech economy have been turned out to be scams. Social media has proven to be fertile ground for a world in which scams make sense and for the diffusion of scams themselves. And we can't seem to get enough of these scams and scammers. Some of the most popular fictional, non-fictional movies, shows, television, podcasts, etc., have all been about scams. So what are we to make of this apparent scam age? So I'm going to use some research today, drawing from my longer-term research on fintech, cryptocurrencies, which I've been looking at since about 2011, and a little bit of recent research on central bank-issued digital currencies, to explore the idea of scams, to reflect on various facets of the work that scams do, and the work that the idea of scams do in both the production of the future and of money itself. So, like I said, I'm a professor, so I tend to turn to historians. And scholars from a variety of perspectives have identified the idea that scams are indeed a social construction. Historian Stephen Mihm has described how, in late 19th century America, at its core, as he put it, capitalism was little more than a confidence game, because as long as confidence was nourished, even the most far-fetched speculations could get off the ground and wealth would increase. The same could be true today. I theorize scams, therefore, as a kind of capitalism out of place. What we call a scam is used to perform boundary work that justifies some and legitimates some form of capitalism and some forms of exploitation and illegitimates others. Scams are particularly important, I argue, to understand now, because the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate capitalism seem to be in flux. In part, this is due to the larger turn away from traditional institutions of the capitalist market economy and of its twin, consumer protection, a turn that the transformation of money from crypto to the platform economy and fintech are very much situated within and accelerating. We are now told that nearly everything, the college degree, the 9-to-5 job, the promise of retirement, at least in the US, the entire market democratic system, is a scam. This may be true, but the claims are almost always an advertisement to move on and jump ship to something far more ambiguous, far more multivalent, and in a word, scammy. Scams then fill and also reveal unmet human need for identity, need for sociality, need for agency, need for a future. Scams not only fill the gaps of failing institutions, but take their shape. And again, as I mentioned with retirement, this may be a particularly American experience, but America is very good at exporting both affect and business models. And a key point I want to make in this presentation is that this boundary work with drawing lines between legitimate and illegitimate capitalism is currently being used to design monetary infrastructures, to terraform the economy of the future. I also want to be sure that we put the kind of global racial politics of scams at the center. While the withering of institutions and the rise of the scam economy feels like a crisis, it is likely only understood that way because this structure of feeling has moved from the fringes, poor women, black and brown people, people in the global south, to the core of the white global north. There are many people for whom institutional promises have never worked, for whom hustling was always a way to get by, for whom respectability was always a losing strategy. And I would point to two key books here. One, LaShawn Harris's psychics, number runners, and black women in New York City's underground economy, and Jovan Scott Lewis's fascinating, provocative work on Jamaican call center scams as a form of economic reparation. Both Harris and Lewis find a kind of liberatory potential in scams. But as the hustle, once racially coded, becomes more mainstream, I am wrestling with how to understand its liberatory potential. In an age where mainstream white supremacist movements, in the United States at least, are saliently marked by grift and scams as the main thing that they do, it's easy to see that scammy populism is far from inclusive. So I want to always kind of remember that talking about scams is also a way of talking about power and privilege. When more people, white people, men, are not being served by institutions, that's when it starts to feel like those institutions are collapsing. So I also want to constantly remind myself as I study scams to ask how new scam institutions re-entrench whiteness. How does the work of categorizing and building infrastructure around scams serve existing power? So in order to kind of tackle scams, I'm going to look at it through 3 angles. 3 ideas that are perhaps seem very different from each other, but I think are very interesting facets to unpacking scams. Part 1, fintech. So as a starting question, I want to ask, how do scams shape fintech? And in some ways, I am perhaps uniquely qualified to study scams because I spent the last decade studying cryptocurrency and payment systems, and have become an accidental expert on scams and, to some extent, their prevention and mitigation. In my 2020 book, New Money: How Payment Became Social Media, I argue that money is, among other things, a communication technology. Money communicates value. I pay you, $20 or 20 euros, and my account is debited and yours is credited, or you now have a 20 euro note and I don't. But these transactions don't happen telepathically. Instead, they are enacted through infrastructures and technologies, which are always instantiations of meaning and power. We often imagine that the politics of money is economic. Who has money, who doesn't, and why? But a focus on money in its communicative form, on payment, allows us to see new meaning and new politics. Who gets to control and profit from communication infrastructure? Who gets to access on what terms? What kinds of traffic get to travel over it? What kinds of transactions are labeled scams, and what kinds aren't? And so the history of money tracks alongside that of other communication medium, including print money, including the post office, including modems, which that is what this is. This third picture is a modem-powered point-of-sale system from the 70s. And indeed, the very same systems that were used to build the early internet were also used to build the infrastructure of payment. And of course, today, mobile phones and social media are the site of innovation for our communicative world, including money. And so too, just as commerce, like any other form of communication, tracks alongside these communication channels, so too does its shadowy other, scams. There have been new scams native to every new financial technology. Scams are a fundamental part of technological change. Each new innovation creates new opportunities for innovative exploitation. Scams work by pushing up against and discovering the limits of technological, economic, and social systems. In turn, scams, like all undesired behavior, shape the norms and rules of communication systems. These rules have institutional effects and consequences far beyond the initial case they were meant to deal with. One of my friends and favorite communication scholars, Tarleton Gillespie, has described that in platforms, every traffic light is a tombstone. That is, every rule is an evidence of a previous lack of a rule. Scams then tell us something about the important socio-technical vulnerabilities in the economy and in communication ecosystems. And so it's also important to note that how the category of scams and the work of fraud prevention authorize surveillance and other forms of social control. Over the years of studying fintech, I have become obsessed with chargebacks, which is like an obscure detail of the way card transactions work, that pretty much controls everything about the way payment systems are priced and managed. And you don't have to understand or follow this chart, but if you're interested, I present it quite a bit in the book. And so chargebacks essentially are when a customer formally requests their money back from a cardholder. And this is, or rather, a customer formally requests their money back from a merchant. And this is usually pursued as a last resort when the customer can't come to an agreement or satisfaction with the merchant themselves, when they, in a word, feel as though they have been scammed. And in my book, I describe how chargebacks, or rather the imagined risk of chargebacks, structure nearly all pricing in the credit card industry. Those merchants who are considered at high risk of chargebacks, whether or not they actually have chargebacks or not, are likely to pay a much higher rate for receiving credit card payments. This is a market for risk that enables merchants to access the network. Some of these are truly scammers, right? Chargeback fees, indeed, have been used to choke off scammers from payment infrastructure. But like all categorization work, there's power here, and lots of ways to wind up on the wrong side of this categorization. And so pornography is a particularly interesting case for two reasons. It's considered high risk for two reasons. First, because of the social stigma, right? A lot of people falsely claim that their spouse or parents or employer, that they didn't make this like transaction for porn, even if they actually did. And so there's a lot of chargebacks for porn. But also, the porn industry itself is scammy. There are lots of surprise recurring payments, shady selling of user lists, and so on. And so now, well, I'll skip this and say, and so it also means that anyone who winds up getting categorized as risky can wind up losing access to payments. In my book, I explore this through the case of a sex worker, an online sex worker named Eden Alexander, a pornography creator whose medical fundraiser, which, yes, we have medical fundraisers in the United States, was labeled pornographic and thus risky for chargebacks, and thus prohibited to be used on the crowdfunding platform because she retweeted a friend who offered pornography to donors. There are countless examples of people suddenly losing access to pay or be paid. And blocked users have very little means of challenging the platform's assessment of themselves and their transactions. Any person who wants to get paid electronically is beholden to and governed by systems that are inconsistently enforced, experimental, opaque, and offer little recourse for contestation. And it's the scam imaginary via chargebacks that drives most of these decisions. This is the case in the US, but across the world, in mainstream electronic payments, there is this slippage between disputes, scams, money laundering, all of which authorize know your customer regulation, which creates heightened surveillance and control, which will certainly be an issue for emerging CBDCs and may make the difference between what could be called a surveillance coin and something that looks more like digital cash. And so to return to the question, how do scams shape fintech? Scams create a paradox for fintech. Most of the time, people want to transact without being scammed, but new payment technologies are fundamentally criminogenic. People are always finding new ways to do crimes with them. At the same time, scams are supposed to be exceptional. And yet, how much of the mundane infrastructures of our everyday transactional lives are shaped by them? How is the future form of tomorrow's fintech being built during this scam age shaped by them? Part 2, the future. And same question, how do scams shape the future? Money, I, alongside many other scholars, argue, is a form of futurity. We only accept money because we think it will be accepted by someone else tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And indeed, all crypto projects are characterized by this futurity. They are at their core an attempt to summon an alternative future in the present. They promise a range of possible futures. Some cryptocurrencies are valuable because the blockchain systems they entail, will someday be seen to have triumphed over centralized and surveillance incumbents. In other visions, existing financial and governmental institutions have become so authoritarian or so incompetent, or both, that cryptocurrencies are necessary to sustain economic and communicative freedom. All of these visions are, on some level, imagining what comes after liberal market democracy. But some of these are also scam cryptocurrencies, scam communities, and scam futures. Crypto is, at its core, an attempt to build a future in which institutions, their paternalism, but also their safety nets, are made obsolete by organizing collective action beyond their purview. Crypto promises freedom, including the freedom to scam and be scammed. Crypto is worth something now in the market and maybe in the future that is promised. This leads to scams like rug pulls, where blockchain creators take the money and run, and pump and dumps, where the trading value is artificially driven up and bag holders are left with a worthless token and maybe a dream shattered. Again and again in crypto, the blockchain dream of a radically decentralized future was deferred to a yet more distant future. But some people make a lot of money in the process, perpetuating the hype that drives interest in the blockchain in the first place. So crypto then can be seen as a frenzy to bring about a future driven by a collective that doesn't even really believe in that future. When I talk to people in crypto through my interviews and research, they tell me time and time again to beware of everyone else that I'm interviewing or talking to. They say to me things like, you have to understand that you can't trust what anyone says because everyone else is just pumping their bags. They're trying to realize a return on their investment in cryptocurrency. In this context, pumping your bags is indistinguishable from promoting your vision for a better world. A true believer is indistinguishable from a shill. A shill is indistinguishable from a rational actor, someone trying, perhaps desperately, to protect their investment, maybe even their life savings. Everyone tells everyone else to hodl, hold on to their investment, don't sell it off, but no one wants to be left holding the bag. No one wants to be the last one left who still believes in the blockchain dream. Crypto scams are ambivalent, but therein lies a frisson, a kind of collective effervescence that makes ambivalent belief in the future and thus collective action even possible. In the popular imagination, as well as in academic literature, though, scams are often seen as individualistic, right? A game with two actors. There's the con artist and the mark. But the scams I see in crypto and in the digital economy more broadly are better understood, to maintain the game metaphor, as a kind of massively multiplayer online game. They are networked, decentralized, without a clear sense of perpetrators and victims. And everyone who participating sort of oscillates between the two roles. Beyond crypto, the digital economy seems to be fertile ground for similar formations. These kinds of activities are both a reaction to the precarity caused by the withering of institutions and a deepening of it. Multi-level marketing, popular retail investing as exemplified by the GameStop rally, work in the pyramid-shaped attention economy, drop shipping, online certification courses from yoga coaching to life coaching, growth hacking, and various other forms of passive income. All of this sits within what could be called the hustle economy, where everyone is reminded to respect the hustle of the next person, to always try to out-hustle them and accept when they themselves have been out-hustled. These activities are frequently described as scammy, if not outright scams. But it's difficult to pin down who exactly is the scammer and who exactly is being scammed. Like crypto, all of these network scams are an attempt to bring about a shared future, wealth for individuals, but also maybe a change in how the economy is run. And that effort is fundamentally characterized by ambiguity and asymmetry. Among participants, there's an uneven likelihood of benefit from the scam and an uneven belief in the likelihood of the promised future. And it's impossible to know who really believes and who doesn't. Of course, network scams, as I've described, are not new. Herman Melville, in his 1857 novel, The Confidence Man, sets this novel aboard a steamship sailing down the Mississippi River. And everyone on the steamship is trying to scam each other. And ultimately, it's unclear to whom the confidence man of the title refers. Everything is blurred. The commerce and con artist and chump. The novel satirizes the idea that, that scams are an aberration within capitalism, but rather indicates that all capitalism is on some level a form of a con. And literary scholars have analyzed this novel and asked questions like, how is it possible? They noted that this novel is asking us to think about how it's possible to distinguish fact from fiction, entrepreneurial ingenuity from a well-disguised fraud, and what kind of moral universe are we living in if we have to walk around asking ourselves these questions every day? But the novel itself is ambiguous. As one literary scholar puts it, that the implicit message of the novel is that it's better to take the leap, trust the confidence man, including our own inner confidence man, because a retreat from commercial society is miserly in a moral sense. You have to be willing to enter into scamful relations to participate in free association for social life itself. And the same could be true today. Are participating in scams a preconditions of terms of participating in the digital economy? Part 3, Florida. So I've grown to kind of begun to realize that there might be sort of deeper autobiographical roots to my interest in scams. I grew up in Miami, Florida in the 80s and 90s, and I've spent my entire adulthood trying to run away from Florida, and I consider getting out of the swamp one of my greatest achievements. And now I find myself drawn back to Florida for the very reasons that drew me away. Florida is quite literally a land terraformed, made possible by scams. The security regulations in the US, notably the Howey test, used to regulate crypto today and other unlicensed securities, were developed in response to Florida swampland scams in the first part of the 20th century. Florida was the crypto, the network scam of the 20th century, the early 20th century. It was the future, but it was mostly a scam future. Florida was also the infrastructure works of the time. And that too was also mostly a scam. Indeed, I grew up right near the terminus of Dixie Highway, which is a highway that was built to connect the Midwest to Miami, as literally a part of a scam to defraud the federal government and create a highway corridor to sell scams. History tells us that the Florida land boom scams went bust with the 1928 hurricane, which devastated Miami. But of course it didn't. Terraforming swampland is also terraforming a future. Dixie Highway, that scam highway building project and highway of scams, of course still exists. I know this because it now has 10 lanes in both directions, and I could hear it from my bedroom at night. Just because all was revealed to be a scam doesn't mean it just goes away. Life in Florida when I was a kid was marked by the experimental, the entrepreneurial, the scammy. Everyone's parents sold vitamins, some sold or smuggled drugs, or timeshares, or modeling contracts, or ran a church or a cult, or were lawyers to those who did. Everyone had a hustle. It feels to me like the Florida of my childhood, which felt like the edge of civilization, has gone mainstream. Two modalities of scam, kind of diagonal in the American geography, Silicon Valley in the Northwest and Florida in the Southeast, are closing in on the rest of the world. And there's this kind of osmotic threshold in which scam reality becomes just reality. Even if the promised future doesn't come to be, some future inevitably does. And so what happens when the future is actually just something that happens in the aftermath of a scam future? So the question I'd like to leave with, the task I think is really important to answer right now as we imagine new forms of the economy, new ways of building infrastructures, is how do you keep living in futures that were never meant to be? How do you keep living in futures that were supposed to be scams? And I will point you to my 2 books, which are available wherever books are sold, little scamming myself. And also I have one article that's been translated into German, and the link is there. Thank you so much.